Kethvaran had seen 10,000 worlds before he ever heard the name human. He was old by the standards of most species. Though young among his own kind, the Luminari, beings of pure light who had been cataloging civilizations since before most stars had learned to burn properly. The Luminari considered themselves the eldest children of the universe, born from the radiation of the first cosmic dawn, and they moved through the galaxy with the quiet confidence of those who had never encountered anything that truly surprised them when the Galactic Concord detected a new spacefaring species emerging from a small blue world in an unremarkable arm of an unremarkable galaxy. Kethvaran volunteered to observe them. It was considered a minor assignment, barely worth the attention of a junior researcher. But Kethvaran had grown bored with the predictable civilizations he usually studied. He wanted something different. He got far more than he bargained for. The journey to human space took him 3 cycles. And during that time, he reviewed everything the Concord had gathered about this new species. The data was unimpressive. Humans were biological creatures, carbon-based, with bodies made mostly of water and soft tissue that seemed almost comically fragile. They lived for less than a century on average, which to a Luminari was barely enough time to form a complete thought. They required constant maintenance just to survive. Sleep for a third of their brief lives. Regular intake of organic matter, careful temperature regulation, protection from radiation that would not have even registered on Luminari senses. Their homeworld was a violent place, prone to earthquakes and storms and floods. Orbiting a star that bombarded them with harmful rays, Kethvaran could not understand how they had survived long enough to develop space travel. When he arrived at the human colony world called New Meridian, he took on a synthetic humanoid form, a body that looked human enough to pass casual inspection, but contained sensors and recording equipment far beyond anything human technology could detect. He established himself as a visiting academic from a distant Earth territory, and he began his observation. His first week among humans confirmed his expectations. They were loud and chaotic and inefficient, spending enormous amounts of energy on activities that seemed to serve no practical purpose. They gathered in groups to consume fermented beverages that damaged their already fragile bodies. They engaged in elaborate mating rituals that involved uncomfortable clothing and awkward conversation. They argued passionately about trivial matters and then forgot what they had been arguing about. Kethvaran recorded everything with growing boredom, already composing his final report in his mind. Another mundane species, destined for quiet mediocrity, nothing of note. Then he attended a funeral. One of the colonists had died, an elderly woman who had been among the first settlers on New Meridian, and the entire community gathered to mark her passing. Kethvaran expected solemnity, perhaps some ritualistic grief, the kind of death ceremonies he had observed on 100 other worlds. What he witnessed instead made no sense. The humans wept. Yes, their faces contorted with genuine sorrow, tears streaming down their cheeks in a display of emotion that seemed almost excessive. But then, without any apparent transition, they began to laugh. They told stories about the dead woman, stories that made them cry harder and laugh louder. Sometimes doing both at the exact same time, they embraced each other, these grieving humans, and they smiled through their tears, and they spoke of the deceased with a warmth that seemed impossible given that she was gone forever. Kethvaran did not understand among the Luminari. Death was a quiet fading, a dimming of light that was accepted with peaceful resignation. There was no laughter at a Luminari passing. There was no crying either. There was simply acknowledgement and release. But these humans seemed to experience death as both a wound and a celebration, a tragedy and a gift. And they held both truths in their hearts at the same moment without any apparent contradiction. He filed his observation and continued his research. His primary human contact was a woman named Dr. Elena Vasquez, a trauma surgeon at the colony's main medical center. She was in her middle years by human standards, with dark hair streaked with gray and eyes that seemed to carry a weight Ket Ferran could not identify. She had agreed to help him with his anthropological research, and she answered his questions with a patience that impressed him. During one of their conversations, she used a word he did not recognize, nightmare, she said, describing why she sometimes looked tired in the mornings. Ket Ferran searched his extensive linguistic database and found no Luminari equivalent. What is a nightmare? He asked. Elena looked at him strangely, as though the question itself was unusual. It is a bad dream, she explained. When you sleep, your mind creates false experiences, and sometimes those experiences are terrifying, and you wake up frightened even though nothing actually happened to you. Ket Ferran processed this information with growing unease. Your own mind creates terrifying experiences for you while you are unconscious and vulnerable. He repeated slowly, yes, and this happens to all humans. Pretty much everyone. Yes, especially children. Children have nightmares all the time. Ket Ferran felt something he had never experienced before, a cold sensation in his life form that he would later learn to identify as the beginning of fear. He had come to study humans expecting to find another unremarkable species. Instead, he had discovered that every single one of them carried a darkness inside their own minds, a darkness that attacked them in their sleep, that created horrors for them to experience even when the waking world offered them none, and they considered this normal. They did not even think it was worth mentioning unless someone specifically asked. Ket Ferran looked at Elena Vasquez, this small, fragile creature who lived with monsters in her own skull, and he realized that his research had only just begun. He had expected to find nothing of interest among the humans. He had been very wrong. In the weeks that followed the funeral, Ket Ferran began to notice things he had previously dismissed as background noise. He noticed that humans asked each other, "How are you?" multiple times per day, and that the expected answer was almost always fine or good, regardless of the actual truth. He noticed that they smiled when they were not happy, that they laughed when they were nervous, that they said, "I am okay," when they very clearly were not. He noticed that beneath the chaos and the noise and the inefficiency, there was something else, something hidden, something they did not speak about openly, but that shaped everything they did. He began to research human psychology. What he found kept him awake for 3 consecutive cycles. His light form flickering with an emotion he could not name. Humans had a condition called depression, a state in which their own brain chemistry turned against them, convincing them that nothing mattered, that happiness was impossible, that existence itself was a burden too heavy to carry. Millions of them experienced this. Millions more experienced something called anxiety, a constant state of fear and dread that had no specific cause, a feeling that something terrible was about to happen even when everything was objectively safe. Their bodies would flood with stress hormones. Their hearts would race. Their breathing would become difficult, all because their own nervous systems could not tell the difference between a real threat and an imagined one. And then there was something called PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, a condition in which humans who had experienced terrible events would relive those events over and over again, triggered by sounds or smells or images that reminded them of their original trauma. Their minds trapped them in their worst moments, forcing them to experience their greatest suffering on an endless loop. Ket Ferran read about intrusive thoughts, sudden unwanted images of violence or disaster that appeared in human minds without warning or invitation. A mother holding her baby might suddenly picture dropping it. A person standing on a tall building might suddenly imagine jumping. A driver on a highway might suddenly envision turning into oncoming traffic. These thoughts were not desires, they were attacks. Their own consciousness assaulting them with visions of horror for no apparent reason. And according to human psychological research, this happened to almost everyone. He found Elena in the medical center break room, drinking a cup of the bitter liquid humans called coffee. And he sat down across from her with a feeling that might have been desperation. "I have been reading about human mental health," he said. Elena raised an eyebrow, but did not seem surprised. "And what have you learned?" "I have learned that your species is under constant attack from your own minds. That you carry darkness inside you that never stops trying to destroy you. That simply existing in a human body is a form of psychological warfare." Elena considered this for a moment, then shrugged. "That is a dramatic way to put it. But I suppose it is not inaccurate." "How do you function?" Kefferan asked, and he could hear the genuine confusion in his own voice. "How do you work and build and create when your own consciousness is constantly trying to tear you apart?" "We cope," Elena said simply. "What does that mean?" She leaned back in her chair and seemed to think about how to explain something she had never needed to put into words before. "It means we find ways to manage. We talk to each other. We take medication when we need it. We see therapists. We exercise. We distract ourselves. We develop routines and rituals that help us feel stable. We lean on the people we love. We take it one day at a time. But the darkness is still there." "The darkness is always there," Elena agreed. "We do not make it go away. We just learn to live with it." Kethvaran thought about the Luminari, beings of pure light who had never known a moment of mental anguish, who existed in a state of perpetual calm that they had always assumed was the natural condition of sentient life. He thought about the 10,000 civilizations he had studied, most of which had developed their own forms of psychological peace, evolved beyond the primitive mental conflicts that plagued younger species. And then he thought about the humans, who had done none of that, who still carried every bit of darkness their ancestors had carried, who woke up every morning and fought battles inside their own skulls just to make it through the day. "I attended an emergency yesterday," Elena said, interrupting his thoughts. "A transport accident, multiple casualties. One of the victims was a child, 7 years old. She was terrified, screaming for her mother. Kethvaran waited. One of my colleagues calmed her down, held her hand, told her stories until we could stabilize her. He is a veteran, served in the Outer Rim conflicts. He has nightmares every night about the things he saw. Sometimes he cannot leave his apartment for days because the fear is too strong. But he helped the child. He helped the child," Elena confirmed. "He took all that darkness he carries, all that pain and fear and trauma, and he set it aside so he could be there for someone who needed him. That is what we do. That is how we cope. We take care of each other." Kethvaran looked at this small, fragile human with her gray-streaked hair and her tired eyes. This creature who battled her own mind every single day and still showed up to save lives. And he felt something shift inside his light form. He had come to study humans as subjects. He was beginning to realize they might be his teachers. The Luminari had a peaceful history. This was not a boast or an achievement. It was simply a fact. Like the color of their light or the temperature of their home star, they had emerged from the cosmic radiation of the early universe already cooperative, already gentle, already inclined toward harmony rather than conflict. War was a concept they understood intellectually, but had never experienced personally. Violence was something other species did, something primitive and unfortunate that civilizations eventually grew out of. When Kethvaran began researching human history, he expected to find the usual pattern, a period of early conflict followed by gradual enlightenment, the slow climb from barbarism to civilization that most species underwent. What he found instead made him want to extinguish his own light and never reignite. The humans had not grown out of violence. They had industrialized it. He read about something called the Holocaust, a systematic effort by one group of humans to exterminate another group based on their religion and ethnicity. 6 million people murdered in factories designed specifically for killing. Their bodies processed like raw materials. Their possessions sorted and cataloged with terrifying efficiency. He read about slavery, the practice of treating other humans as property, buying and selling them like livestock, forcing them to work until they died, and then replacing them with more. Entire economies built on the ownership of human beings, lasting for centuries across multiple civilizations. He read about the atomic bombs dropped on 2 cities called Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Weapons so powerful, they vaporized tens of thousands of people in an instant and poisoned the survivors with radiation that killed them, slowly over years. And the humans had built these weapons knowing exactly what they would do. He read about torture, not as an aberration, but as a common practice throughout human history. Governments and religious institutions developing sophisticated methods to inflict maximum pain on human bodies. Sometimes for information, sometimes for punishment, sometimes simply for entertainment. He read about child soldiers and mass graves and ethnic cleansing and genocide after genocide after genocide. Each one documented in terrible detail because humans wrote everything down. They kept records of their atrocities, the way other species kept records of their achievements. Cathvaran stopped reading when he reached something called Unit 731, a facility where one group of humans conducted medical experiments on another group of humans, including live dissection without anesthesia. He could not continue. He found Elena at her apartment that evening, and she could tell immediately that something was wrong. "What happened?" she asked. "I have been studying your history." Alana's expression changed, becoming something Cathvaran could not quite read, sadness mixed with something else. Something that might have been shame. "Ah," she said quietly. "You found the bad parts." "The bad parts," Cathvaran repeated, his voice rising in a way that surprised him. "Your entire history is bad parts. Your species has done things to itself that I could not have imagined, that I would not have believed any sentient creature capable of. You have tortured and murdered and enslaved each other on scales that defy comprehension." "Yes," Elena said, and there was no denial in her voice, no excuse, no attempt to minimize what he had discovered. "We have. How can you stand there so calmly? How can you live knowing what your species has done? How can you look at another human without seeing all that blood?" Elena sat down slowly, and Cathvaran saw that his words had affected her more than he had intended. "We cannot look at each other without seeing it," she said. "That is exactly the point. I do not understand. We teach our children about the Holocaust," Elena said. "We take them to the camps, to the museums. We show them the photographs and the films and the records. We make them look at what we did so they will never forget. So they will recognize it if it starts to happen again. You deliberately expose your children to these horrors. We deliberately make sure they know," Elena said firmly. "We do not hide from our past. We do not pretend it did not happen. We carry it with us, every single one of us, the weight of everything our species has done." She stood and walked to her window, looking out at the colony she had helped build on this distant world. "You want to know how we live with it? We live with it by choosing every single day not to repeat it. We know what we are capable of. We have seen the evidence. We have read the testimonies. We have walked through the camps and the killing fields. We know exactly what humans can become when we let the darkness win." She turned back to face him. "And every day we wake up and we choose not to let it win. We choose to be better than our ancestors, not because we are different from them, but because we are exactly the same. We have the same capacity for evil inside us, the same darkness, the same potential for cruelty. But we also have something else. What? We have memory, Elena said. We remember what happened when we gave in to the darkness. And we choose not to let it happen again. That choice. That daily deliberate choice to be good, despite knowing how easy it would be to be evil. That is what makes us human. Kethvaran thought about the Luminari, who had never needed to make such a choice because they had never known the temptation. He thought about all the peaceful species he had studied, who were gentle because they had never learned to be anything else. And he thought about the humans, who knew evil intimately, who carried the memory of their worst moments in their collective consciousness, and who woke up every morning and chose to build hospitals instead of gas chambers. He was beginning to understand. Something profound innocence was not the same as virtue. The Luminari were not good. They had simply never been tested. The disaster came without warning on a Tuesday morning when the sky was clear and the colony was just beginning to wake. Reactor 3 experienced a catastrophic failure in its containment system. And within minutes, a cloud of radioactive material was spreading across the eastern sectors of New Meridian. The alarms began screaming at 0647 local time. And by 0650, the evacuation orders were being broadcast on every channel. Kethvaran was in the market district when it happened, and his first instinct was to observe. He had studied humans for months now, learning about their darkness, their history, their capacity for both tremendous evil and surprising kindness. Now he would see how they behaved when catastrophe struck. Part of him expected the worst. He had read too much human history to believe they would not turn on each other, that the thin shell of civilization would not crack under pressure, that the darkness inside them would not finally break free. He watched as the first wave of panic rippled through the crowd. People were screaming, running, pushing, the chaos of 1,000 frightened animals all trying to escape at once. He saw a man knock down an elderly woman in his rush to reach the transit station. He saw a child separated from her parents, crying in the middle of the street as adults rushed past her without stopping. This is it. Kethvaran thought, this is what they truly are. This is the darkness I have been waiting to see. And then something changed. The man who had knocked down the elderly woman stopped, turned around, and went back for her, lifting her in his arms and carrying her toward the evacuation point. His face twisted with shame at what he had almost done. A teenager Kethvaran had never seen before scooped up the crying child and began calling out for her parents, refusing to leave her alone. Even as the radiation warnings grew more urgent, a group of colonists formed a human chain to guide people through the smoke and confusion, their bodies serving as living signposts in the chaos. And then the first responders arrived, running toward the reactor while everyone else was running away. Kethvaran watched in disbelief as humans in protective suits charged into the contamination zone, knowing full well what the radiation would do to their fragile bodies, knowing that they might absorb lethal doses in their effort to contain the breach. He followed them, his synthetic form immune to the radiation that was already beginning to claim human lives. What he saw inside the hot zone would stay with him for the rest of his existence. He saw engineers working frantically to seal the breach, their skin already beginning to blister from the exposure, refusing to abandon their posts even as their bodies began to fail. He saw medical teams setting up triage stations in the shadow of the burning reactor, treating the wounded while radioactive ash fell around them like snow. He saw ordinary colonists carrying their neighbors, their co-workers, complete strangers, out of the danger zone, making trip after trip despite the growing radiation sickness that made each journey harder than the last. He found Elena in the main medical center, which had been converted into an emergency treatment facility. She had been on duty for 12 hours when he arrived, and she would continue working for another 24. Her hands steady, even as her body shook with exhaustion. She was treating a young man whose burns covered most of his body, speaking to him softly, telling him he was going to be okay. Even though they both knew she could not promise that. Dr. Vasquez, Kethvaran said, unable to stay silent any longer, you need to rest. The radiation levels in this building are dangerous. Alana looked at him with eyes that held no fear, only determination. There are people who need help. You cannot help them if you die. Then I will help them until I die, she said simply, and turned back to her patient. Kethvaran watched as she worked, as all of them worked. These fragile, terrified humans who knew exactly what they were risking and did it anyway. He saw a father carry his daughter for 3 miles through contaminated streets, his lungs burning with every breath, refusing to stop until she was safe. He saw a grandmother shielding her grandchildren with her own body, absorbing radiation that should have killed her so that they might have a chance to survive. He saw strangers holding hands as they walked through the evacuation corridors, drawing strength from each other, refusing to let anyone face the darkness alone. They were afraid. All of them were afraid. He could see it in their faces, in their trembling hands, in the tears that streamed down their cheeks, even as they kept moving forward. But they did not let the fear stop them. They did not let the darkness win. They acknowledged their terror, and they acted anyway, saving lives not because they were fearless, but because the lives of others mattered more than their fear. Kethvaran finally understood what he had been seeing all along. Human courage was not the absence of fear. Human courage was feeling the full weight of the darkness, the terror and the pain and the certainty of suffering, and choosing to step into it anyway for the sake of others. The Luminari had never known fear because they had never had anything to fear. But humans, these fragile, short-lived creatures who carried nightmares in their minds and atrocities in their history, they knew fear intimately, and they had learned to walk through it. That was what made them remarkable. That was what made them beautiful. That was what made them something the Luminari had never been and might never become. The disaster at New Meridian killed 237 colonists. It could have killed thousands more, but it did not. Because humans ran toward the danger instead of away from it. Because they chose each other over themselves. Because they faced the darkness and did not look away. The Council of Radiance had existed for longer than most stars. They were the eldest of the Luminari, beings of such ancient light that they had witnessed the birth of galaxies, and they governed the affairs of their species with a wisdom that had never been questioned. When Kethvaran returned from his observation of humanity, they summoned him to deliver his report. The chamber was vast and filled with light. Thousands of Luminari gathered to hear the assessment of this new species that had emerged from a small blue world in the outer reaches of the galaxy. Kethvaran stood before them in his natural form, his light pulsing with emotions that he had not possessed before his time among the humans. You were sent to observe the species called humanity, the eldest counselor said, her voice like the ringing of distant bells. You were tasked with determining whether they pose a threat to galactic civilization, and whether they are worthy of contact or should be quarantined until they mature. What have you concluded? Kethvaran had prepared his report during the long journey home, but standing here now, he found that the words he had planned seemed inadequate. I have walked among the humans, he said finally, and I have seen true darkness. A ripple of concern passed through the assembled Luminari, their lights flickering with worry. The counselors leaned forward, ready to hear about the threat that this primitive species might pose. The darkness I found was not what I expected, Kethvaran continued. It was not in their weapons or their armies or their capacity for destruction, though they possess all of these in abundance. Then where did you find it? The eldest counselor asked. Inside them, he paused, letting the words settle over the assembly. The darkness lives inside every single human. It is woven into the fabric of their minds. They carry nightmares that attack them in their sleep. creating horrors for them to experience, even when the waking world offers them none. Their own brain chemistry can turn against them, trapping them in states of fear and despair and hopelessness that have no external cause. They experience intrusive thoughts, sudden visions of violence and catastrophe that appear without warning or invitation. Simply existing in a human body is a constant battle against their own consciousness. The luminary flickered with confusion and something that might have been pity, but the internal darkness is only the beginning. Kat Varan said, "Their history is written in blood. They have tortured and murdered and enslaved each other on scales that I could not have imagined. They built factories specifically designed to kill millions of their own kind. They developed weapons capable of destroying their entire species, and they used them on each other. Their ancestors committed atrocities so terrible that I had to stop reading about them because I could not process what I was seeing. Now the assembly was truly alarmed, their lights pulsing with fear and disgust. This species sounds like a grave threat to galactic peace." One of the counselors said, "We should quarantine them immediately, perhaps permanently." "You have not heard the rest of my report," Kethvaran said. He moved to the center of the chamber, his light burning brighter than it ever had before. "The humans know what they are. They do not hide from their history. They teach it to their children. They build monuments to their worst moments. They preserve the evidence of their atrocities so that future generations will never forget what they are capable of. They carry the weight of their ancestors' sins in their collective memory. Every single one of them. Why would they do such a thing? Because that knowledge is what makes them choose differently." Kethvaran said, "Every morning, every human wakes up knowing exactly what their species can become when it gives in to the darkness. And every morning, they choose not to give in. They choose kindness. They choose compassion. They choose to help each other instead of hurt each other. Not because they are ignorant of evil, but because they know evil intimately." He turned slowly, addressing the entire assembly. "I witnessed a disaster during my time among them. A catastrophic accident that killed hundreds and threatened thousands more. I expected to see them turn on each other, to see the darkness finally break free. Instead, I watched them run toward the danger. I watched them sacrifice their own lives to save strangers. I watched them face their own terror and choose to help anyway. They were afraid," Kethvaran said. "I could see it in their faces. They knew exactly what they were risking. They understood that they might die, and they did it anyway, because, to them, the lives of others were more important than their own fear." The chamber was silent now. Thousands of ancient beings hanging on his words. "The Luminari have never faced true darkness," Kethvaran said. "We were born in light. We have existed in harmony since the beginning of our consciousness. We have never known fear or despair or the temptation of cruelty. We are not good. We have simply never been tested." He met the eyes of the eldest counselor. "But the humans have been tested every single day of their existence. They have been tested by their own minds, by their own history, by their own capacity for evil. And they have passed that test over and over again. Not because it is easy, but because they have decided that goodness matters enough to fight for." "What are you saying?" the counselor asked. "I am saying that we have nothing to teach them. I am saying that their darkness, the very thing that makes them seem primitive and dangerous, is actually their greatest strength. It is what makes their kindness meaningful. It is what makes their courage real. It is what makes them capable of a depth of love and sacrifice that we have never achieved because we have never had to struggle for it." Kethvaran moved toward the exit of the chamber. "Humanity is not a threat to us. They are a lesson. They are proof that goodness is not the absence of evil, but the conscious rejection of it. They are proof that courage requires fear, that compassion requires the capacity for cruelty, that light only means something when it exists in opposition to darkness." He paused at the threshold. "I am requesting reassignment to Earth. I want to learn from them, not as an observer, but as a student. Because the humans have achieved something that the Luminari never have. What is that? They have earned their goodness. Keth Varan said, every single day, with full knowledge of the alternative, they have chosen to be kind. That is not primitive. That is not something to pity or fear. That is the most beautiful thing I have ever witnessed in 10,000 years of existence. He left the chamber and never looked back 6 months later. Keth Varan stood on the surface of Earth for the first time. His synthetic form breathing air that smelled of ocean and growing things. Elena Vasquez was there to meet him. Fully recovered from the radiation exposure she had sustained during the disaster. Her gray-streaked hair now almost entirely white. You came back, she said. Smiling, I could not stay away, Keth Varan replied. I have too much to learn. She laughed and took his hand. This fragile human, who carried darkness in her mind and history in her heart, and still somehow managed to radiate warmth. Come on then, she said. Let me show you around. As they walked together into the human world, Keth Varan learned his first phrase in the language of Earth. 3 words that had no equivalent in any Luminari dialect. 3 words that could only come from a species that knew suffering intimately. It gets better. And somehow, impossibly, beautifully, they believed it.